Hey, folks, this is Hal Shurtleff with the Camp Constitution Report, which is heard on a somewhat irregular basis, at least once a week. I might do two or three a week. And you can find these on our Podomatic page, as well as Spotify, iHeart, Amazon, and sometimes on YouTube. And this particular episode will definitely be uploaded on YouTube. Now, some of you may know that I write a monthly column for a paper called the Weir's Times, which is published out of the Lakes region of New Hampshire. I'm not sure what the circulation is, 20,000 maybe, plus it has an online presence. But it's a great little paper. It's a free newspaper that people pick up, and it has a subscription base that goes beyond the state of New Hampshire. I also write a column for the Boston Broadside, which is a monthly newspaper coming out of Massachusetts, and that's a great paper as well. So this is an article that I'm going to review with you that I just finished, and this will also give me a chance to edit it because I mean I edited. When you edit something, you can do a you can do the spell check on Word and grammar. But if you use a word, you might spell a word right, but if it's the wrong word, it's not going to look too good for you. It won't catch it. So if you use there, Their instead of There, yeah, it's going to be spelled right, but you've got two different words going on there. Yeah. So, and there's a lot of people make those common errors and say, oh, you don't put the right contraction and the apostrophe and what have you. And sometimes when you do a lot of rewriting, you might have a dangling sentence, or you might forget to delete some things as you're rewriting it. And that's the issue. And I learned that the hard way when I put a book in publication. I did about I don't know how many spell checks, and then to find out there was a number of errors. So I'm gonna read this article. I'm not gonna read it necessarily for every single word, but but then I'll make a little commentary. Books you are not supposed to read. Now, of course, by entitling it books you're not supposed to read, I'm encouraging people to actually read these books. And this isn't something I originated. I know this term's been used before. I know in the Politically Incorrect Guide book series books, they have that. Tom Woods, who wrote a book about the politically incorrect guide to American history, there'll be on every other page or every third or fourth page would be a little sidebar saying his recommending a certain book on the topic that they're covering in the in the story in the book itself. So this list I have compiled isn't in any particular order except the last book, and are just a handful of many books. I think I have about 9 or 10 here that may reinforce, challenge, and or change the reader's worldview. All of them are either in print and or available on Amazon, except one which has been banned by Amazon, but available from its publisher. The first book I'm mentioning here is Richard Nixon, The Man Behind the Mask. And let me just give a little aside here. My former landlord back in 1988 or 87 loaned me this book. And so it really changed the way I look at things quite dramatically. So as let me just continue with the article. As a young junior high school conservative, I defended Richard Nixon against my liberal classmates. At the age of 29, a friend loaned me Nixon, The Man Behind the Mask by Gary Allen. Allen points out that Nixon was not a conservative, to say the least. Under the Nixon administration, we got the Unconstitutional Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, which has wreaked havoc on American manufacturing. He opened up communist China, which eventually led not only to diplomatic recognition, but to communist China's global dominance. We also I could have added under Reagan most favored nation trading status, but this book was published before Reagan took office. Nixon allowed technological transfers to the Soviet Union, making it possible for the Soviets, I should say, to make nuclear missiles with multiple warheads. After reading the book, I stopped defending Nixon. This book opened my eyes to the influence and power of what is not known as the deep state. In those days, we made reference to the conspiracy of the insiders, and today the deep state. Although a lot of people don't really have the proper definition of the deep state. They think it might be just a few rogue FBI agents or what have you, a few people who have been appointed or tenured employees. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. The best enemy money can buy. This book, written by Professor Anthony Sutton of the Hoover Institute, documents how elements in our U.S. government have been funding, aiding, and abetting the Soviet Union even before the Bolshevik Revolution. We are still aiding and abetting our enemies. Sutton wrote a series of books that I also recommend, including Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler and Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution. But this book, The Best Enemy Money Can Buy, was a book that came out, I think, after. It wasn't his last book, but it was one of his last books. It was sort of a compilation of some of his really larger books, or say tomes, because he would publish the receipts. I mean, literally publish the receipts of all this. And what's fascinating to me today is that the American left seems to have a hatred of Russia, but up until recently, even up until the Obama administration, the left had a long time love affair with Russia, the Soviet Union, and they did everything in their power to make the Soviet Union possible. And this book is just incredible. And of course, you don't hear about these kinds of books. That's why I say you're not supposed to read them. Memoirs by David Rockefeller. It was my late friend Don Folkers that turned me on to this book. This book was published in 2002. Memoirs is an autobiography of David Rockefeller, whom I consider one of the evilest Americans that lived in the last 100 years. And in parentheses, I've got Arm & Hammer, Henry Kissinger, and Zbigniew Brzezinski are three more. Why do I draw that conclusion? In David's own words from his biography. I won't read the whole thing. I'll just read the first paragraph. For more than a century, ideological extremists at either end, these people love to use that word extremist, at either end of the political spectrum have seized upon well-publicized incidents, such as my encounter with Castro, to attack the Rockefeller family for the inordinate influence they claim we wield over American political and economic institutions. Some even believe we are part of a secret cabal working against the best interests of the United States, characterizing my family and me as internationalists and of conspiring with others around the world to build a more integrated global political and economic structure. One world, if you will. If that's the charge, I stand guilty and I am proud of it. And then he goes on to say that all the big newspapers kind of kept things quiet so they could do their dirty work. And so here we're saying that these right-wing extremists and even some left-wing extremists are correct. Very fascinating. And this book is in both hard copy and paperback. And the paperback, the actual page of this particular comment, they're different. They're in different pages. So you might just be able to find. You can go online and just find these two paragraphs. It might be worth instead of having to buy the book. The Creature from Jekyll Island. I like words sometimes, but sometimes it's a little difficult. Okay. The Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin. I had the honor of helping to sponsor a speaking tour of the author back in the mid-1990s. I believe it was his first speaking tour for the book. This powerful and well-documented book exposes how the Federal Reserve Bank was created in complete secrecy at the Jekyll Island in a meeting at a lodge. It explains how the Federal Reserve Bank, creates money out of thin air, how it manipulates the economy, how it is an instrument of war, and that the Fed is not an arm of the U.S. government, but a cartel between bankers, not your local bank, however, and the government. So don't get on the local bank and say they're part of this. They wouldn't even know what you're talking about, most likely. The health hazards of homosexuality. This book, like most books that present factual info on this subject, have been banned from Amazon. Most Americans have been bullied into silence. At least they'd be accused of being called some type of phobe, with no phobias being minted on a regular basis. We're not supposed to bring up facts like those who engage in unsafe sexual practices generally have shorter lifespans than those who don't. Indeed, we are told by government at all levels that we must celebrate these lifestyles, and governments are spending millions of dollars doing just that. Thankfully, those that lead this movement have been experiencing some pushback. A book like this will help those pushing back with much needed information. This book is available from Mass Resistance, and I have the website. It's massresistance.org. and it's easy to get. And it again, it's compiled, it's facts compiled by physicians who deal with homosexual patients, and it can be a little disgusting because some of the things these folks do are, let's face it, disgusting, and I won't go into that. Death by Government by R.J. Rummel. This book, authored by a liberal professor from the University of Hawaii, demonstrates the deadliness of government. I should put totalitarian government because not all governments murder and kill and do horrible things to their citizens. Professor Rummel proves that more people have been murdered by totalitarian governments in the 20th century in peacetime than in all of the wars of the 20th century. Professor Rummel coined the word democide. So this book is not something you sit down with, when you're sunning in the backyard or at the beach. It's kind of a difficult read, but it's essential. And back in the late '90s, there was an article in one of the Boston newspapers saying that some of the city councils were objecting to the fact that the city of Boston was selling some of its surplus police weapons. And when they discovered they were being sold to governments in Central America, they said, "Oh, well, that's different. It's being sold to governments, no problem." And I actually had a little book, not a book report, you call a book review of this book, which I think came out in the mid '90s to late '90s. And I said, "You really think giving governments guns is a good thing?" Here's a history of that. Don't think I don't think it made a difference though. When it comes to the city of Boston, it's been an ideological closed shop for many many years. Tornado, oh, in a junkyard, not through a junkyard. I got to make that correction. This book, by the way, this book is authored by a friend of mine whom I've interviewed a number of times, authored by a friend and former atheist, and written in layman's terms, refutes evolution on the most one of the most destructive ideas that mankind has faced, leading to the loss of faith in God. While Mr. Perloff doesn't claim that all evolutionists are racist, he shows the readers its racist roots. Perloff also points out that evolution influenced Joe Stalin, leading him to reject Christianity and embrace communism. Christianity and the Constitution, the faith of our founding fathers. Colonel John Eidsmoe, a friend and camp constitution and constitutional attorney, refutes the argument that the framers of the U.S. Constitution were deists. He makes the case that John Calvin was one of the founders of the United States. Calvin, of course, lived long before the United States was created, but his biblical concept of innate depravity led to the founders, I should say, influenced the founders to have a separation of powers. And most of the there were some Calvinists, but even if you're not a Calvinist, you can still be influenced by the teachings of John Calvin. And one of his main teachings was the innate depravity of man. And it says in Isaiah that our righteousness without God, I'm not quoting it verbatim, are like filthy rags. Uh, and that's why they gave us a constitution that was strictly limited. And you can read the Constitution and say, well, there aren't any Bible verses quoted in here. There's only a couple of references to, I think, Sabbath and Sundays accepted, I think, and say, well, this is not a Christian document. But if you look at it, it had to have been from the mind of someone with a Christian worldview, or the people who wrote it had a Christian worldview. Um, yeah, so Eidsmoe contends that the U.S. Constitution could only have been written by with those of the Christian worldview. John Adams affirms Colonel Eidsmoe when he said that the U.S. Constitution is for a moral and religious people, and he went on to say it is highly inadequate for the governments of any other. Now, this is something I really like to point out. This book, Black Rednecks and White Liberals by Thomas Sowell. This book is an antidote for self-loathing whites who believe that our nation's founders were all white supremacists who invented slavery. Professor Thomas Sowell, now a nonagenarian, which means he's in his 90s, writes that slavery has been around since recorded history and that it wasn't until close to the end of slavery was racism used to justify it. So it wasn't based on race. And he points out in the book that two bordering nations were at war, and the victor enslaved those who lost. And then as time went on, it was profitable to take black slaves from sub-Saharan Africa across the Atlantic Ocean because of the sailboat. You couldn't do that before that, and also across the desert, which is where most of them went. And the Muslims introduced slavery to sub-Saharan Africa. And of course, many black chieftains sold not just nations that they conquered or tribes they conquered, but even their own people, their own members of their own tribe. And he said also goes into say how Great Britain and the United States, I would say Great Britain taking the lead role, um, were the ones that led to the end of slavery in the world. And Thomas Sowell has a really good YouTube channel. Has a lot of his interviews. I think there's about 250 videos. I think you should probably get a degree in Sowellology if you get a chance to watch every single video. Some of the videos are excerpts of his books that are voiceovers. Just quite the intellectual man. And I found out in one of the interviews that he tried out for the Brooklyn Dodgers, and I used to read his weekly columns in the Boston Herald back in the 80s and 90s, and just look forward to reading his stuff. And just an incredible, a national treasure. Um, Debunking Howard Zinn, exposing the fake history that turned a generation against America. Mary Graybar, a Camp Constitution instructor, exposes the blatant anti-Americanism promoted by Howard Zinn. Zinn's book, People's History of the U.S., has been used in our nation's government schools to promote a hatred of our nation and its history. Zinn has a particular hatred, I should use the word contempt, of Christopher Columbus. Mary says to record straight, I'm the great explorer. I should say great navigator. The U.S. Constitution, while not a book, it is something that most elected officials, especially those at the federal level, don't want you to read because it will show that they, while claiming to uphold it, have been spending most of their political careers violating it. Don't believe me? Just go on any mailing list of our federal elected officials. Now, living in New Hampshire, we have a moderately conservative House and Senate, State House and Senate, but all four of our federal delegates are far left Democrats. Almost everything they brag about. And so if you live in a state where you got some half decent members of Congress, you may not experience this. But if you live in a state with Democrats and some neocon Republicans, you will see almost everything they brag about in their emails is blatantly unconstitutional. But they know that the vast majority of the voters know nothing about the proper members of Congress. And I don't offer this to the general public, but if anyone reaches out to me, and as long as it's within the 50 states, not the 48 continental states, but all 50 states, um, I'll send them a free pocket copy. Just shoot me an email, campconstitution1@gmail.com. Now, I have the best for last, and I put the Bible last, again, because it's the most important one. I put this book, which I believe is the inspired word of God, last because it is the most important. For centuries, enemies of God have done their utmost to keep it from you. There are at least 52 countries, Muslim and communist, where the Bible is illegal. While it is still legal in Western Europe and Canada, one can go to jail for proclaiming some of the teachings of the Bible, including the biblical view of homosexuality. Um, I will let some of our nation's founders make the case for the Bible. Here is John Adams. The Bible contains the most profound philosophy, the most perfect morality, and the most refined policy that ever was conceived upon earth. And his son, the Bible, John Quincy Adams, the Bible is of all books in the world that which contributes most to make men good, wise, and happy. And the last quote here, I won't read them all. The Bible contains more truths than any other book in the world. Benjamin Rush, he was one of the signers of the Declaration, a doctor from Philadelphia. He was also, I believe, one of the founders of the Bible Society. So this will be posted to our blog. And you may want to, if you're listening to this, you may want to recommend other books that I could add to this. I do these little book reviews from time to time, nothing comprehensive, but just little snippets. And even if you pick up a couple of these books, I think if you haven't already read them, but introduce them to other people. Again, I say they can be life-changing, definitely life affirming. And if you're an activist and you really need good ammunition to back up what you believe, the books that I've just mentioned will do that. So anyway, I want to thank you for listening. You've been listening to the Camp Constitution Report with your host, Hal Shurtleff. And until next time, may God richly bless you. And by the way, visit our website, campconstitution.net. If you like what we do, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, subscribe to our Podomatic page, And if the Lord lays it upon your heart, make a donation. You can do it through PayPal. Thank you, and God bless.